Hello again, and today we will continue learning about chemistry by discussing organic chemistry. So as a review from your previous lecture, chemistry can be divided into inorganic and organic chemistry. So organic chemistry, these are compounds that contain carbon, okay? And again, I never say never. So except for carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide, that's the exception. All other organic compounds are going to have carbon. Carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide, those are both inorganic compounds. So examples of your organic compounds are carbohydrates, which are sugars, your fats, which sometimes you'll see the word lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And these are usually going to be very large molecules. Okay, they're usually polymers or things that are smaller units put together to make bigger units. And these are all organic. So think about if you go to the grocery store and you buy organic, so think life. Things that are living are going to be carbon-based on the earth anyway. And so if you want to go back and date something, maybe you're an archaeologist and have found something from millions of years ago, you can carbon date it. So living things contain carbon. So your organic compounds are things that you would think about associated with life. Living things have carbohydrates and fats and proteins and things like that. So the carbohydrates are your sugars and your starches, things like glucose and lactose and fructose and sucrose. All your sugars are examples of carbohydrates. I don't make you learn the chemical structure, but all carbohydrates contain carbon and hydrogen and oxygen. The function of your carbohydrates, they're your major source of cellular fuel. So for example, glucose. We use glucose as the precursor to make ATP, which is the actual energy source that we use. So if you're tired, a lot of times we'll go grab some quick energy, we'll grab a candy bar, something sweet, and then our body's able to take that glucose and break that down and turn it into ATP, which we can kind of use for energy. So glucose is a quick energy source, so carbohydrates are our primary way that we get energy. We also use some sugars as structural components. So if you look at RNA, which is part of your DNA RNA system. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Some of the structure that holds RNA together is actually made from a sugar. And we think about carbohydrates. Remember I said organic compounds are typically going to be smaller units put together to make bigger units. We call those polymers. And so with sugars, they can be monosaccharides or disaccharides or polysaccharides. So hang on, I'll show you what that means. So a monosaccharide is just one single sugar, okay? So it's not a polymer, it's just the individual smallest component. And so some examples of monosaccharides would be glucose, fructose, galactose, deoxyribose, and ribose. And again, I'm not going to make you remember what the structure of these are, but I do want you to know some examples of some monosaccharides. So again, glucose, fructose, galactose, deoxyribose, and ribose are common monosaccharides. Now, if you take two monosaccharides and stick them together, bond them, you get a disaccharide. So you're putting two monosaccharides together. And so if you put a glucose and a fructose together, you get sucrose. If you get glucose and glucose together, just two of them, you get maltose, and a galactose and a glucose makes lactose. So people that are lactose intolerant, lactose isn't an individual molecule. It's actually a glucose and a galactose bonded together to make lactose. So monosaccharides are single sugars, disaccharides are two monosaccharides bonded together. Now a polysaccharide is more than two, so long chains of polymers. And so an example of a polysaccharide would be glycogen, which are long chains of glucoses bonded together. And glycogen is one of the ways we store energy. We store glycogen in our liver. So if you eat some sugar, glucose, we take that into our bodies, our liver will make that into glycogen, which we can store, and then if we need that later, we can break that glycogen down and use the glucose to make ATP. So monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides are the things that we associate are forms of carbohydrates. Now the next class of organic compounds are your lipids or fats. Okay, so I use these words interchangeably, so your lipids and fats basically mean the same thing. And again, I'm not going to make you learn too much about structure. I'm going to show you what they look like, but I do not expect you to memorize chemical structures. But with fats, you've got a carbon and a hydrogen and an oxygen, not as much as in carbohydrates. And sometimes there'll be a P. Do you remember what P stands for? It's not potassium. That's a K, phosphorus. So it has a phosphorus associated with it. And lipids are insoluble in water. Now carbohydrates, they break down in water, but your lipids do not. So think about oil and water. Oil and water don't mix. If you have a glass and put water in it and pour some oil on top, the oil is going to float. It won't dissolve or combine with the water. And there's several types of fats that we're going to talk about. You have your neutral fats or your triglycerides, your phospholipids, and your steroids. So these are all examples of types of fats or lipids. So your triglycerides, these are your neutral fats, and they're made up of 3 fatty acids that are bonded to a glycerol, so triglyceride. So here's your glycerol molecule. You have 3 fatty acids, and you bind those together to make a triglyceride. And these are important because we use those for energy storage. We use them for insulation and protection. So if you think about adipose tissue, which is the fat tissue on your body, it's mostly made up of triglycerides, which is how you can use it to insulate your body and to protect your organs. Fat acts as a cushion. And it's a way that we can store energy. So if we are in a time of famine and we don't have any sugars and we don't have any food, we can start to pull from our fat reserves and turn that into energy that we can use. Now, when you think of triglycerides, this is when you've heard in the media, maybe everybody's all about saturated fats, and you're like, what does that mean? So the saturation of fatty acids, that's just the way they're bonded. And again, I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of how these things are bonded. But when you think about fatty acids, they can either be saturated or unsaturated. And saturated fatty acids are always going to be solids. So animal fats, things like butter. So think about a steak, the white stuff in the steak, that's the fat. So anytime it's a solid fat, that's going to be a saturated fat. And if it's a liquid fat, these are unsaturated. Okay, so things like olive oil, plant oil, things like that. Now I realize you can melt animal fat and it turns liquid. So think about what these fats look like at room temperature. Okay, so your animal fats are going to be solid, your plant fats are going to be liquid. Obviously, if you've ever put olive oil in the refrigerator, it will kind of solidify. But again, think about room temperature. People who have cholesterol problems, they need to stay away from your saturated fats. Saturated fats tend to increase cholesterol in people. So a healthy diet is going to have low amounts of saturated fats, and you're going to increase your amounts of unsaturated fats. So these are your bad fats, and then your unsaturated fats are your good fats, okay? So you just want to, when you're in your diet, you want to moderate. You don't want to have just all saturated fatty acids or just all unsaturated fatty acids. You need to have a good balance of both, with more unsaturated than saturated fatty acids, especially if your family history has a high prevalence of high cholesterol. You want to stay away from saturated fats. Okay, so another example of a lipid are your phospholipids, and these are just a modified triglyceride, and phospholipids are real important. We're going to talk about them again when we talk about cell biology, and we use our phospholipids. They actually make the membrane of the cell. And so if you look at a phospholipid, they have a head region and a tail region. So again, I'm not going to make you get all caught up in the chemical structure of it, but they have a head end and a tail end. And so because they have polarity, they have a side that's water-loving and a side that's kind of water-hating. And so they will actually align themselves in the cell membrane. And I'm going to talk to you more about that when we get to cell biology. But these phospholipids are very important. If you look at a cell, the thing that holds the cell together, which is called the cell membrane, is actually made of these phospholipids. Okay, so your cells are actually made up of basically a fat bag to hold the cell components in, like your nucleus and things like that. Again, we'll do a little more about that when we get to cell biology. Another example of your fats are steroids. And steroids are things like cholesterol, vitamin D, steroid hormones like testosterone, and some of your bile salts. So these are the things that are made by your gallbladder. So, for example, this is what a steroid would look like. Again, I'm not going to get you, make you memorize what they look like, but just know some examples of steroids. All right, so the next major class of organic molecules are your proteins. And again, proteins are polymers. They're long chains of smaller units, and what you use are amino acids. And there's 20 types of amino acids. I don't have them here on this slide. I do want you to look in your book, and there's a list of your amino acids. You do need to recognize the names of the 20 amino acids. I don't need you to memorize their structure, but I would like you to know if I use a term that you know that it's amino acids. So go to your book and look up the amino acids and learn the 20 amino acids, because it is an important thing that you should know. Because when you're looking at ingredient lists, and maybe if you're thinking about building muscle and you buy some of those weight gain protein powders and things like that, it'll have all these things listed, and sometimes it'll list the amino acids. So by knowing these amino acids, it's just more knowledge. So go to your book and learn some of these amino acids. Some examples I just put on here were lysine, glycine, and aspartic acid, but I would like you to at least go to your book and look and learn the 20 types, or the 20 amino acids. These have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sometimes sulfur, and sometimes phosphorus. Again, don't worry about the structure, but do go and look at the names of the 20 amino acids. So when you take an amino acid and you bond it to another amino acid, you're going to make these chains. And so proteins come, they have structure. As these amino acids bond to each other, these bonds, they will kind of start to form these proteins and make them actually have a structure. And so when we talk about proteins, we say we have primary structure, or secondary structure, or tertiary structure, or quaternary structure, which is a hard one to say. And so I'm going to talk about what that means. And so primary structure just means it's in a straight line. Okay, it's just an amino acid, an amino acid, an amino acid linked together into a long chain. That's a primary structure. A secondary structure means it's starting to twist or kind of form a helix. So you have a helix is a secondary structure. So those bonds are starting to kind of grab each other and twisting the protein. Okay. Or a secondary structure can be where you take a bunch of primaries and just line them up like sheets. Okay, so you kind of get these sheets, but it has more structure than primary. It's stacks of primary proteins stacked together to make a sheet. So I kind of say this is primary and then twist it is secondary, or this is primary and stack them is secondary. Now tertiary means that you basically twisted up these proteins. And so you've kind of twisted up a secondary protein. Those bonds have grabbed each other and kind of caused the protein to really twist up. So you think primary and it's twisted, and then it twists again to become a tertiary structure. So this is an example of a tertiary structure. One of your thyroid hormones is carried through your blood by a protein called prealbumin, and it's a tertiary structure that's important in carrying some of your thyroid hormones through your blood. Now, a quaternary structure is one where you've taken two or more tertiary structures and bonded those together. So here's a tertiary structure, here's a tertiary structure, and you stuck them together to make a bigger structure. And so that's quaternary. So primary, twisted secondary, twist again tertiary, put two tertiaries together, quaternary. So when you think of proteins, we can divide them into kind of two main groups based on what they do. And you have your fibrous or structural proteins, and then your globular or functional proteins. So structural, think scaffolding. They're things that give other things structure. So example, in your skin you have keratin, elastin, and collagen, and that helps give your skin its shape. And we'll talk about these as we move into the skin units. And you also have some contractile fibers, and we'll talk about these when we get to the muscles. So you have structural proteins. And then you have functional proteins, and these are going to be round. Globular, globe means round. And these are going to be molecules, proteins that can go out and kind of do things. Okay, they're not necessarily going to have to just stay in one place and be structural. So for example, you have antibodies, and these are part of your immune system, and we'll talk about that later. You have hormones, which are part of your endocrine system. Hemoglobin, this is going to be part of your cardiovascular, your blood. And so hemoglobin is what actually carries oxygen in your body. And then you're going to have enzymes. So all these are examples of these functional proteins. And again, as we move through the semester, we'll talk about these different proteins and whether or not they're fibrous, structural, or globular, or functional. So these are just some examples for you to know right now. Now I'm going to do another video on enzymes, so I'm just going to hit the high points right now. But remember, an enzyme, we've kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. So with enzymes, these are those biological catalysts, and again, I'm going to do a little more on this in the next video. But what enzymes do is we want reactions to occur in our body in a timely manner. And so we need something that allows those reactions to occur faster. And so basically what an enzyme does is allow something to occur faster because it increases the speed of the reaction by lowering the activation energy. So almost think about it like inertia. So if you're trying to push a car, once you get it started, you can push it even faster. Once you finally get the inertia to get the first wheels rolling, once it's rolling, it's going to go faster. But if you were to put something in front of the car and you never could get the inertia going, it wouldn't roll. So if you're trying to get a reaction to occur, it can take a lot of energy to get it started. But if you put an enzyme in there, it doesn't take a whole lot of energy to get that reaction started. So again, we'll talk about this in a separate video as well. The key to enzymes, to know if it's an enzyme, is look at the last 3 letters. If it's ASE, then it's an enzyme. Okay, so we're going to talk about nucleic acids next, and examples of the nucleic acids are DNA and RNA, and these are huge. These are the largest compounds in your body, so the largest organic compounds. And so think your DNA, that's your blueprint. It's found in your nucleus. It's basically your genes and your genetic material, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. These are going to contain carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, okay? And so to make a nucleic acid, you've got to have a nucleotide. I'm going to show you what that is. You're going to have some kind of a base, some kind of a sugar, and some kind of a phosphate. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid, deoxyribonucleic acid. So the deoxyribo, this is the sugar, okay? So the deoxyribose is the sugar that's involved. And it's made up of 4 bases. You have an adenine base, a guanine base, a cytosine base, and a thymine base. And we'll cover this when we talk about DNA replication and protein synthesis. We'll kind of go over this again. But we always abbreviate adenine with A, guanine with G, cytosine with C, and thymine with T. So you need to kind of learn those 4 bases and their letters. And DNA is double-stranded, so it's going to be a double-stranded helix. And this is where we have our genes. And what genes are, genetic material, is they are the blueprint that tell us how to make proteins. Okay, and again, we're going to cover all this in the cell biology unit again. So this is just an example of what DNA looks like. So here's your, so chemically, you have your deoxyribose sugar, you have your base, and then you have a phosphate group. And so this would be an example of adenine, and this would be thymine, and they're going to bond together. So you have a single strand here, and then another strand here, and then they bond together and make this double-stranded helix. And that's what DNA looks like. And again, we'll cover it in a little more detail in the cell biology unit. And this is ribonucleic acid. So ribose is the sugar, and we call that RNA. You have bases again that make it, so it's just going to be one strand. It's single-stranded. It's not going to be double-stranded. And I didn't have a really good picture, but I think there's one in your book that you can look at. You have adenine again. You have guanine again, cytosine again. But in RNA, you use uracil. So the 4th base is uracil instead of the T. And so it's single-stranded, and it's mostly going to be active outside the nucleus. So DNA is always in the nucleus. We don't use DNA outside the nucleus. But RNA, we use it a little bit in the nucleus, but mostly it's going to do its job outside the nucleus. And there's actually 3 types of RNA. We have messenger RNA, transfer RNA, and ribosomal RNA. So remember, DNA is the blueprint for the protein. RNA actually carries the message, and it plays the more important role in actually making protein. So when we talk about protein synthesis, DNA just kind of stands there and acts as the blueprint, and RNA kind of does all the work in making the proteins. And again, we'll talk about that a little later on. All right, and then the last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to organic molecules, this is super important. I always tell my students in my classes, if I ask a question, the answer is always ATP. You know, it's kind of the running joke in my class. And ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And this is the energy that our cells need to do work. Okay, so this is actually, when we say we're using energy, we're using ATP. And we can do that by making, we can break down glucose using cellular respiration, or we can break it down using glycolysis. And we're going to talk about what that means in the next cell biology section of the course. But ATP is basically how we, is the form of energy that we use. Okay, so this is what ATP looks like. It has an adenine, adenosine. It has a sugar, ribose, and then it has phosphate groups. If it has one phosphate group, we call it AMP, mono. If it has two phosphates, ADP, diphosphate. If it has three, adenosine triphosphate. And ATP, this is what we're trying to get. We want ATP. This is how we actually store energy that we can use for things like muscle contraction. So if you think back to chemical bonding, when we talked about that, the bonds that hold these phosphates on, these are high energy bonds. And when you hydrolyze, which that means cut with water, when you break these bonds, they release energy. Okay, and these are high energy bonds. So when you take ATP and you break those bonds and release those phosphates and release that energy, that's what we use to contract our muscles. And we've got a long way to go before we get to that, but right now I just want you to know that ATP is made up of an adenine, a ribose, and then three phosphates with high energy bonds. All right, so that's all we're going to talk about in this video, and I thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.